just had a background of everything that went on in the state of Minnesota, particularly on the University of Minnesota. And then as the pro teams came in, the Lakers and the North Stars and the Vikings and the Twins, he had a background of everything. So anything that came up, Sid had some insight as to what was going to happen, and he had the instinct of a reporter that he knew things that were about to happen, so he was in on the ground floor of everything, and he also had a base to which to report what he was doing. And if Sid said it, bank on it, it was true.
Part 2 of our interview with Bud Grant is now moved to 5:55, so we got time to chat with our next guest and then also get to Royce at the bottom of the hour. Time for both of these interviews to breathe. Bob Hagan, longtime media relations maven. That's what I call him. I don't know what his fancy title is. Doesn't matter to me. It's just media relations maven for your Minnesota Vikings. And, I'm glad actually Guardsy played that Bud soundbite, because part of what I would think would be fascinating for you and challenging is the number of times you found yourself in a position where you're dealing with both of these legends, Sid, age 100, Bud, age 93, and often, I'm assuming, putting them together or making sure they're okay or getting done whatever they want to get done. What's that been like for you, Bob Hagan?
Well, thanks for having me on, Dan. Being around those two, really has been amazing. I mean, I've probably had 500 lunches minimum with, those two guys together. I picked up the tab on most of those too. But something that I don't think people give enough credit. A lot of people think, Sid was, Bud's best friend because, that he was the coach, took the team to all the Super Bowls and the playoffs. But, the truth of the matter is they were best friends when Bud was 18 years old and Sid was 25. So it's really been a remarkable relationship over those years, and to spend the time around those two together has really been priceless. We
had, Chad on earlier. He was very emotional, not surprisingly, and very insightful, I thought. Like I said, you were around Sid a lot, man, over the decades, a lot, maybe more than ever in some ways. And so what's the last 24 to 40 hours been like for you? I mean, how down are you right now?
Extremely. Yesterday I found out on the sideline in the third quarter, and, I spent the next quarter and a half in tears in the locker room. So I didn't see much of the game. You can insert your own joke here on the game, I guess.
Yeah.
But, it was very tough. I just went and saw Sid Friday night at his house, and stopped by there after work and spent an hour there hanging out with him, and certainly didn't think it would be the last time I'd see him.
I don't think, again, this is a good example. I know most of your average people that have no reason to know it about how much time, like you said, you spent around Sid. I mean, you got to know him really, really well, worked with him, I know, helped him. And so it's got to be, so you're feeling it also beyond what he was as this, newspaper guy and radio guy. He became very much a friend to you.
Yeah, he was great. He was great to my entire family. I think that's another thing that, I really like hearing Chad talk about, how much he always talked about family, always asked about my family, always asked about how my mom was doing, who has Alzheimer's. He came to my kids' graduation parties. He came to their hockey games and tennis matches, and those are two sports he knows absolutely nothing about. So, he was very special, to all of us. And, the more you're around him, the more fun you'd have. Every time you'd have a dinner or lunch with him, you'd have 4 new stories to tell other people. Well, he was amazing.
Well, let me ask you. So you mentioned the number of lunches you had with Bud and Sid. What would you just listen? Would you moderate? Would you be in the middle of it? How would those lunches, on the average, how would they go?
Yeah, I would play off the history. Most of those lunches a lot of times involved the late Fred Zamberletti and Paul Wiggin also. And it was just, I kind of thought it was fun, to be with the old timers and to hear their stories. And Sid's recollection, till the day he died was unbelievable. His memory for things was, second to none of anybody I've ever met, even in his late years. He was really amazing when it came to that.
Do you remember how you first got to know him, whether there's anything notable about that before you have developed and accrued all this history with him?
Yeah, I think, everybody with Sid gets a nickname at some point. And in 1991, I got an internship with the Vikings in February, and he was coming over, and I was helping him get interviews, and he had no idea my name or anything like that. And somehow I ended up with my friend getting to know Norm Green with the North Stars. And my friend and I would see him before every game. Norm didn't know I worked for the Vikings at this point, and we became a good luck charm during the playoff run. And so he invited us up to the owner's suite when it got to the Stanley Cup semifinals,
wow,
conference finals. And when we got up there, Sid was in there, and he was like, "How did this kid, who's an intern, make it up to the owner's box?" So he gave me the nickname Norm Green Jr. And that was a cool nickname for about 2 years when we went to the Stanley Cup finals and were doing well. And then it was a terrible nickname for the next 14 years. It was the worst name in town you could have.
Oh, I never heard that one. That's a classic. Norm Green Jr. Oh, my goodness.
From years 3 through 14, I was like, do not call me that. This guy took the team out of town. Nobody liked him. It's the worst name possible. And then I finally threatened. I said, no more interviews with Randy Moss or Mike Tice unless we get rid of that nickname. And it's gone away the last 16 years.
Were you around then when Denny got hired? Because he wanted Pete Carroll, obviously, with his relationship with Pete. Do you remember any of that? Because he got very cranky through that early period at first when Denny got the job and his guy. And I don't think it had anything to do with Denny. It was anything anti-Denny. It was just so much he was pro-Pete.
Yeah, he went after Roger Hedrick at the time pretty good on that one because he had been told one thing and it was another, and
right.
That was at the end of my internship before I got hired full time in 1992. So I got to see that side of Sid, but it wasn't. He was mad at him during the press conference, but immediately when the press conference was over, he went right up to Dennis Green and said, "I'll be the best friend you have in this town." So he can change very quickly.
That's also true. I've heard you tell the Prince story. Guardsy played some Prince music on the way in, but it is worth retelling once again from the Super Bowl several years ago when Prince had an impromptu meeting with Sid because Sid did not really give him much choice.
Yeah, it was the Super Bowl is down in Miami. Is about 10 years ago. Sid was about 90 years old, and he calls me on the phone. And Prince is going to be doing the halftime show, and he's going to be doing a press conference on Thursday at the convention center. And there's going to be 1,500 media there for the press conference, which turned out to be a press conference / concert. And so Sid calls me on the phone. He goes, "Hey, I'm going to come pick up my credential." And I said, "Well, you can't pick it up at this time because I'm going to be at the Prince press conference." And he said, "Well," he goes, "Yeah, I want to talk to Prince. Why don't you have me see Prince?" And so I start to argue with him on the phone and tell him he thinks I'm setting up an interview with the Vikings backup linebacker. I'm like, it's not that easy. And he wouldn't take no for an answer. He shows up to there, and I thought I was going to be able to further explain, and I still couldn't get anywhere. And he's like, "No, I just want to see him for a little bit." And so I said, "All right," and I, did something that I'm like, "Why am I doing this?" But here we go. So we get to checkpoint number 1. I just flash a credential, and I just said, "Follow me." We get to checkpoint number 2. I said, "Don't say a word. Just let me handle this." And the guy just looked at us, and he's like, "This guy's 90 years old. What problem is he going to cause?" Because my credential would work, but his wouldn't.
Right.
So we finally get to the last checkpoint, and the guy says, "You can't go any further than this, even with the top credential." And I had to think on my feet, and I just said, "Sir, with all due respect, the guy about to go on stage and this guy I got right here are the two most famous people in Minnesota." And he let us through. And we walked through, and Prince was walking down this long hall. He's just about to turn to go onto stage. And Sid yells at the top of his lungs, "Hey, Prince! Hey, Prince!" And we have about 15 security guys come across the two of us. And Prince stops, turns around very slowly, and parts the sea of all these people and walks all the way back to us and has a 5-minute conversation with Prince. And it was pretty amazing. It really was.
Do you remember what they talked about? I mean, because I'm wondering if Prince, they went
to the same high school, 50 years apart.
There you go. Yeah.
But they started talking. They talked Vikings, and they talked Timberwolves because he had been a season ticket holder at both. And they talked sports for a little bit, and they said, "Nice to see you." And to this day, Sid just thinks that was easy to set up, and that just
of course
happenstance.
Well, about his insistence to get what he wants, I'm sure that's not the first time, even though that's a very unusual circumstance. That's not the first time you had to go toe to toe with him, and I'm sure almost be forced to surrender, right? I mean, that is really the story of his approach journalistically. Was he's just irrepressible. I mean, he was one of those guys who was not going to take no for an answer.
No, I think his persistence and drive is what really separates him from the rest of the crowd. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, and then we'd spend weeks trying to set up a certain person, for an interview that he'd want. And the second you'd get it, the second he finished that interview, he'd ask for the next biggest person right then. It's like,
yes.
So what have you done for me lately? But he was always on top of things, and, just amazing with that.
Did you guys ever do what Louis said occasionally they did in hockey? Hide his tape recorder, put it in the freezer or anything to kind of get him going?
Well, there was guys who did that. I mean, when I first started the Vikings, he would travel on the road trips on the plane, coming home from the game.
Sure.
And we'd have those name tags on every seat on the plane, so the players and coaches and front office people knew where to sit. And we would be just going through the regular MSP airport, and as people would walk by, they would slap their name tag on his back. And so he'd be walking through the Minneapolis airport with 50 of these tags on his back, and then he would turn to me and he'd say, "God, they love me. They all love me." And we would play a game 7 days later, and the same thing would happen over again, and he would never figure it out. And he'd get home, and he'd have 50 of these players' name tags on his back.
What are you going to do with yourself, man? Honestly, it's such obviously a part of who you are. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but I say it in part because you should feel so good about the relationship and about all those times that you had together. The total investment that you have in him should, to me, be the comfort at a time like this, because you had all of that, and it's going to be sad to not have it, but at least you had it, and you had it in a way that a lot of people can't even begin to appreciate. That's got to be the strength for you right now.
Yeah, it is, and a lot of times when maybe a pet peeve of mine when people die and they're older, people are like, "Oh, he's 100 years old, he's a great life," and I say, that is correct. But that means you also knew him longer, so it makes it that much tougher. So, I just, it's going to be tough. We had that 100th lunch planned at Louis' place. It was a great guest you just had on, and that was going to be on Tuesday, March 17th. And you made the list this year.
I know. I was shocked I even made the list. And I
had 100 people come.
Better yet, I was going to go. Which being the hermit I am, that in itself was amazing.
Yeah. So I think of all the great times. Yeah. I had tons of people in my office today, telling some of the stories that sometimes I didn't even know, and he's just a remarkable person. He's been great to the Vikings. He's been great to the Wilf family when they took over. he's been great to this entire community and this entire region. He will be missed.
I really, Bob Hagan, Media Relations of Minnesota Vikings, I really appreciate the time, your willingness to open up, and you're to be commended for your devotion to him, and far beyond your job, which obviously, because he became a friend to you and became something far more personal as well, and you're to be commended for that. We always appreciate your contributions. You know that very much, and we're thinking of you today because I know it's hitting you probably as hard as pretty much anybody for reasons that I think will be apparent to anybody who listened to this interview. Thanks again, Bobby.
All right, thanks for having me on.
Much appreciated. That is Bob Hagan, Minnesota Vikings.